Ladies and gentlemen, blessings this evening. It is a pleasure to be here with you tonight. We got an incredible show tonight. We're going to be doing Q&A. We're going to be talking about a very heated topic, and we also just had Halloween last night, so maybe we're going to be taking some questions about that. My name is Jorge Gil. I am the executive director for Cross Examine, but I am here with my good friend Abdu, and we are here with Embrace the Truth Ministries. If you're watching this, we're going to be giving you a set of instructions on how to get a copy of Abdu's latest book. And his book is More Than a White Man's Religion, and the subtitle is Why the Gospel Has Never Been Merely White, Male-Centered, or Just Another Religion. And you can go ahead on and start asking questions about this. I'm going to be cataloging your questions and bringing them up to Abdu. So what I want you to do is make sure that you go to YouTube and find the Abdu Murray YouTube channel and help us get to 1,000 subscribers so we can get our own handle and we can start bringing you way more awesome content. Okay, and without further ado, let's go ahead on and bring Abdu in. Abdu, how you doing, brother?
Great, Jorge. How are you, man? It's great to spend this time with you.
It's fantastic to have you here, man, and it's just great that we're able to reach so many through the internet and to be able to serve others and to minister to others through the internet. So, Abdu, to begin with, you have two awesome videos regarding Halloween. So we're going to be touching on that maybe a little bit. But the question for tonight is Christianity the only worldview that dignifies all human beings? So I'm going to give it to you and I'm going to let you unpack that for us.
Yeah, thanks, Jorge. And, I'm a student of various worldviews. I came from a non-Christian worldview, and having studied various worldviews, I've really come to see that I think the answer to this question is yes. Now, that is a simplistic answer, but it's hopefully it's a
Hey,
simple answer.
Abdu,
Hope
give
it's
me
not.
just a
Yeah.
second. It looks like there is no audio for some odd reason. People cannot
Oh.
hear us.
Oh.
So let's see what's going on. Okay,
Okay. Yep.
fixing this. Fixing this, and we'll just fixing this now. Let's let the people know.
Okay.
Okay, for some reason, I have audio coming out. I don't know why they said there's no audio.
Oh.
So yeah, I don't know. My audio is coming out. So let me see.
Okay.
Why? They said no, there is audio. Somebody says, Jorge, there is no audio. They probably don't know how to. I know, and I know what the problem is. This is my buddy here, Yantiel from Puerto Rico. He don't know no better, man. He's saying there is no audio, and everybody know that there is audio. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna fire him because he's one of the mods for my YouTube channel. So I'm sorry for that false start. I'm gonna actually let me go ahead on and play this for him because I think he deserved this. Abdu, what do you think? Does he deserve this?
You're fired.
Let's hear it.
Right there.
You're fired.
Oh boy.
Yeah, he deserves to be fired. No, so go ahead, Abdu. Go ahead on and take it over from here.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thanks. As I've studied various worldviews, I've become convinced that the answer to this question is Christianity the only worldview that dignifies all human beings. I think the answer is yes, but I don't want to be so simplistic as just to say yes, because I think how I want to answer this is that I think that the Christian worldview is the only worldview properly understood biblically and through the lens of the life of Jesus that justifies the very idea of human dignity. I say that because so many other worldviews, whether it's theistic worldviews from Islam, Judaism, uh, uh, various forms of Hindu belief, or even pantheistic belief, they all strive and will argue that they dignify human beings in terms of their essential humanness. But I think that the issue is, can they justify that claim? And I think that the claim would also have to be made of naturalism as well. Can naturalism, the idea that all there is nature, essentially, can naturalism or atheistic views outside of naturalism, can they all justify the claim that all human beings are essentially dignified? It's funny, in a previous book I wrote, grand central question, I actually tackle this question from the standpoint of secular humanism. When you look at secular humanism is the idea that humans are essentially sort of special or valuable or dignified. That's what humanism actually means. But you don't need God. That's where the secular part comes in. In other words, human beings are special, objectively valuable, I should say. But you don't need God to justify the objective truth behind that. Now, that's the claim. And in Grand Central Question, I argue that the claim, while well-meaning, actually is not well-founded. And we actually find that there is a fundamental tension between the idea that human beings are objectively valuable, but the idea also that there is no God who actually seats that objective truth in reality. So let me take it to a story of something that happened to me when I was young. When I was 11 years old, I remember going to a pizza shop near my home with some relatives, and I think a friend was with me as well. I can't remember if it was a friend or not, but I know it was some relatives with me. And we were all young boys, and we walked into this pizza shop. We ordered our pizza, and it's one of those pizza shops where you don't get to eat inside. You basically take the pizza out, and you use a takeout place. Well, we were young boys, and so we got our pizza, and we did what young boys do, is we used the outside garbage can, literally the flat top garbage can outside the pizza shop as a table, which is inherently disgusting, but we were 11-year-old boys, so we are inherently disgusting. And as I was sitting there doing this incredibly unsanitary act of eating pizza off of garbage can, I remember staring blankly, as young boys often do, directly back into the pizza shop, and there was this huge pane of glass, and there was a reflection of what was going on behind me on the on the pane of glass. As I'm staring at the perfect reflection of the cars whizzing back and forth, and I'm thinking whatever 11-year-old boys think, I glimpsed through something right through the pizza shop window, past the glare, to see the guy who literally just gave me my pizza with this incredibly stern look on his face, with his head cocked to the side and his hand raised in an obscene gesture toward me. And I was shocked. I didn't know what to think about that. So I, for whatever reason, felt impelled to walk into the pizza shop, and I asked him, "Are you doing that for me?" And he said, "Yeah, that's right, Camel Jockey. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Camel Jockey." Now, I don't know if this term is used very often anymore to refer to Arabs. I certainly don't hear it very much anymore, but I guess I wouldn't, because they wouldn't call it to my face necessarily. But he did. This 18, 19-year-old boy, I don't know how old he was exactly, but he was definitely an adult, is looking at me with contempt, and he's demeaning me solely because of my ethnicity. I inherently felt undignified. I inherently felt robbed of my essential humanness. And that's what he had done that day, was take an 11-year-old boy and rob him of something based solely on his skin color or based solely on his appearance. Now, I don't know what his worldview is. For all I know, he could have been wearing a cross around his neck. That doesn't mean much today. Crosses are just decorations as well. But I remember thinking to myself, how can this be? How can I feel this badly about this? And I remember walking out and muttering something under my breath, and him saying something along the lines of, "That's right, keep walking," or something like that. I'm not sure what he wanted to have happen there. Did he want me to engage in an altercation with him? Did he want me to walk away? I'm not sure what he thought he was going to do to an 11-year-old boy. But I remember feeling incredible tenseness and incredible anxiety and incredible sadness, among other things, as I walked out. It's funny, to this day, I was 11 years old. That was 38 years ago. And to this day, I drive past that pizza shop, and that's my first memory. That is my lingering memory, despite all the times I had at that place. What makes sense of the outrage we have over this kind of thing? You know, I think about what I felt and now the outrage I felt since then. And I'm sure there are people who are listening to this story, who have heard this story, maybe even read the story, because it does feature in my book, who feel a similar level of outrage. What justifies that outrage? And we rightfully should be outraged, but what makes it a rightful outrage, as opposed to just a social condition, as opposed to just a response by a bunch of chemical computers that are responding to external stimuli because one other chemical computer happened to feel a certain way because of the chemical reactions that I felt as a chemical computer hearing certain auditory stimuli that made me feel a certain way? Or is there really something more to me and to you and to all of us that suggests that it wasn't just one chemical computer, that guy, talking to another biochemical computer, me, that made me function in a different way. Maybe there's something more to our humanness. Maybe there's something inherently and indelibly sacred to every human being that justifies our moral outrage at that action. Now, I say that not as somebody who's experienced prolonged and repeated racism or ethnicism or whatever it might be. What I experienced there was but a sliver, but a taste, but a morsel of the bitter pills that many people have swallowed, far worse than what I had to swallow that day. But I do have a recognition of this. I understand what it's like, at least in a small possible way, to go through that. And so as I began to study various religious systems and various worldviews, whether atheistic or religious, I began to ask myself the question is, how is it possible that we look for the dignity of human beings? We're outraged when someone else's dignity is robbed of them. How do we justify this? Now, from an atheistic standpoint, I think that essentially that justification is lacking. Now, I want to be clear here and to say that you don't have to be a Christian to feel the outrage. You don't even have to be a Christian to be right, pardon me, in feeling that outrage. No, what I would suggest is this, is that though the outrage is there and though the outrage is rightful in a sense, your particular worldview, I think outside of the Christian faith, doesn't provide sufficient justification for why we should feel outraged in an objective sense. In other words, that it's always wrong at all times to treat people as less dignified because of their ethnicity or because of their gender, whether they're male or female, just because of their ethnicity or their gender, male or female. What makes that objectively a problem? And I think on naturalism, you have some pretty serious issues you have to contend with. For example, when you think about why we're here, and I think of Stephen Jay Gould and his very famous statement about the late, by the way, Stephen Jay Gould, the late evolutionary biologist who coined the term punctuated equilibrium about how we see the fossil record through evolution. He was pointing out why we're here and what it is about human beings that gives life meaning, if there is any such thing. He says essentially this: we are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures, because comets struck the earth and wiped out dinosaurs, thereby giving mammals a chance not otherwise available. So thank your lucky stars in a literal sense, which is funny. Because the earth never froze entirely during an ice age, because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn, he says, now listen, we may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. Now I want to pause for a moment there. This explanation where there is no higher answer, just something that we give ourselves because our evolution and luck happen to be such that our species happen to survive and develop from prior species, he calls this troubling, superficially troubling, if not terrifying. It's ultimately liberating and exhilarating. I've never been superficially terrified before. Being terrified of something like the yawning chasm of meaninglessness is not a superficial thing. It's actually quite a profound thing. But then he says that this idea that meaning is not objective is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. He says we cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct these answers ourselves from our own wisdom and ethical sense. There is no other way. Now, that seems empowering, that seems ennobling, that seems to give us the right to become our own gods. But the problem is that if there is no other way, when we look at history and human beings therefore become the arbiters of all that's meaningful or all that's good or all that's moral, when you look at human history, what that means then, if we are the determiners, when the majority of human beings thought that it was right to own people as property, and human beings are the determiner of what's valuable and what's right and what's wrong, that means that when most of us thought that owning people as property was the norm and could be okay, then it actually was okay. We weren't ignorant of the fact that it was wrong. No, we were the determiners of what was right and wrong. And because we determined that by majority rule, by mob rule, to be right, it therefore was actually right. In other words, there was nothing objective about it. It was based solely on the subject. It was based solely on the opinion of the subject, which is human beings. You know, Alfred Lord Tennyson eloquently put it, is that nature is red in tooth and claw. the evolutionary process that gets us to where we are now is basically the domination of the stronger over the weaker or the less advantaged members of different species, so that the species get better and better and better. But that process is not innocent. That process is red in tooth and claw. That's what's so superficially troubling, if not terrifying, about what it is that Stephen Jay Gould proposed, is that everything that got us here is essentially that. Now, that would obviously be not a terrible leap to apply from a biological standpoint right to a physical standpoint and say that people, based on their ethnicity, based on their geographic location, based on the stage of which someone actually has achieved industrial revolutions or technological revolutions, one can easily see how one could use this kind of a paradigm where the weak are dominated by the strong to justify how we can subjugate other people because they're women or because they're different than us in some way, because they have less power. And therefore power is somehow, I think wrongly, but in their mind, possibly rightly, a justification for why others should serve us and lack any kind of sense of dignity. It wasn't me who even thought of this idea, of course. It was, think about the luminaries like Michael Ruse, where he says, I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring to something above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation, he says. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. And any deeper meaning is illusory. It's simply a matter of evolutionary epiphenomenon that keep us from eating each other as well. In fact, Darwin himself pointed out that there was a very serious issue where if it was the case that humanity was evolved from prior species through a process of natural selection acting on random mutation, then you're going to have a subjugation or a differentiation within a species. Darwin famously said, with savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. In other words, our sense of morality flows against the evolutionary stream. We build asylums for the imbecile. These are his words, not mine. We build asylum for the imbecile, the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. Thus, he says, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. In other words, caring for the sick and regarding them as dignified in some way, caring for those who we might consider to be inferior in ethnicity or whatever it might be, is somehow wrong because we're not progressing the way evolution actually desires that we do so. So I think that this is actually something in itself for us to actually wrestle with. It was Richard Weikart who said that Darwinism by itself did not produce the Holocaust. Of course it didn't. But without Darwinism, especially in its social Darwinistic and eugenics permutations, neither Hitler nor his Nazi followers would have the necessary scientific underpinning to convince themselves and their collaborators that one of the world's greatest atrocities was really morally praiseworthy. Now, we have to be careful here because we're not saying that people who actually hold this view are therefore naturally going to be people who don't dignify all human beings or seek the dignity of all human beings. I know plenty of people who don't believe in God or believe in some other religious system who actually do that. But what Richard Weikart is pointing out is that while holding a lack of belief in God or disbelieving in God's existence doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to act this way. His point is that when you remove God as the foundation, when you remove the sense of the objectively existent personhood of God, you therefore remove all grounding for the objective value of any personhood at all, because now it's simply a matter of human opinion. Now you look to other worldviews as well, and I don't want to necessarily criticize worldviews to the extent that people seem to like to, because all of them are trying to find out something about what's wrong with humanity and how can we fix it. I think about other worldviews. There was a book by Stephen Prothero called God is Not One, where he, as a religious historian, a professor of comparative religions, points out that though there are so many worldviews, they all have fundamental foundational differences in how they apply right and wrong and good and evil and concepts of reality to the world. But they all start with the same starting point, which is that something is wrong with the world, and humanity is at least plays at least some part in the wrongness of the world. So they all start from the same starting line, but the race goes off in different directions because none of them share the same finishing line. So I think that that difference makes a world of difference, because it is inherently the case that every worldview, in one sense, has various levels of equality among people based on their devotion levels and whether they have the right amount of devotion to achieve karma that actually yields some kind of enlightenment, for instance, in pantheistic systems, or if you've done enough good deeds to justify your worth to God and therefore he'd let you in, as in other works-based systems of belief. What I would say is it's the Christian faith, and I'll close with this essentially, is that the Christian faith that essentially says that all human beings are essentially equal because we all bear something in us that is not derived from our physicality. In other words, we're not equal because we're all physically the same. We're clearly not physically the same. There are people who have physical infirmities, who are born with physical infirmities, who have to struggle through those kind of things. We're not all mentally the same. There are people of, within and across various ethnicities, all of whom share tremendous capacities for intellectual and physical prowess, but also among whom are people who are physically and mentally challenged in some ways. So to say that we're all equal in a physical sense is to sort of foist a fiction upon ourselves, because that's just not the way biology actually works. But we are essentially equal. And we don't need our physical bodies to justify that. We don't need to say this person is capable in so many other ways. We don't need to go through those machinations. We can show their abilities. We can show people who have physical challenges or mental challenges might have wonderful abilities that outstrip our own. That certainly is a possibility. But we don't need to go through the calculus of finding out if someone's abilities make them equal, because then that's just simply an earned equality. We have to earn it once again. No. It's not even by virtue of just being human in a biological sense. There's something to us that is not dependent upon the physical, and therefore not dependent on the opinion of other physical beings, that makes us all equal. I didn't derive my dignity and my equality from other human beings, or from my community, from the state, or from the global community of humanity. I didn't derive my equality from there, or my essential dignity. No, the one who is the creator of all of the universe, the objective first person, or the objective non-caused person, who is God, is the one who created all existence. And therefore, when he says, let us create man in our image, and he creates us male and female after his image, he creates us. That means that is what gives us equality. I bear God's image, God's infinitely valuable and beautiful image, as much as anyone else does. And they bear it as much as I do. And because I did not give that image to them or myself, I dare not. I have no basis upon which to judge anyone as less than me. But I can say that everyone is equal before the eyes of God. And this is where the Christian message comes in. The cross tells us that we are all not only made in God's image, but also that we were equally fallen from God, that we are all sinners. On an equal footing, every one of us falls short of God's glory. Now, why is that actually ultimately liberating? Contra to what Stephen Jay Gould says. The reason why that's actually liberating is because the cross says, and I'm borrowing from John Stott in his wonderful book, The Cross of Christ, the cross gives meaning to our moral choices. It's not just the good things that God takes regard of, but the bad things that we do, the evil that we've wrought in this world, actually are taken into account by God. They affect. Think of the dignity God infuses to each one of us when he says that every single action you do actually affects him. My actions as a single human being within the thousands of years of human history and the millennia of existence of the entire universe, my actions, just mine, affect the creator of everything. That's how significant he takes my actions. That's a dignifying of a human being that I think no other worldview can actually give to you, because what I do matters. It matters so much that it separates me from him because of his moral perfection, but because of his moral love, because of his objective love, because of his unbounded love, he sends his son to die on a cross for me. What I did in my past and will do in my future, and any human being has done, has caused God to do something that is self-sacrificial, that hurts him but helps us. That's what it means for the cross to give each of our actions dignity. Both the good and the bad have consequences for the eternal. They echo into eternity. And David Bentley Hart and others have pointed this out so wonderfully, that these ideas of equality were fictions to our pre-Christian ancestors. They weren't even fictions. They weren't even thought of. Listen to what Bentley Hart says when he considers the idea of how Christianity, I should say, the actual gospel message, not Christendom itself, but the Christian message itself actually brings and breeds the idea of dignity, and actually gives birth to the idea of universal human dignity. This is what he says. The ethical presuppositions intrinsic to modernity, for instance, are palliated fragments and haunting echoes of Christian moral theology. Even the most ardent secularists among us generally cling to notions of human rights, economic and social justice, providence for the indigent, legal equality, or basic human dignity. Listen now, that pre-Christian Western culture would have found not so much foolish as unintelligible. They wouldn't have laughed at it. They wouldn't have even thought about it. It is simply the case that we distant children of the pagans would not be able to believe in any of these things. They would never have occurred to us had our ancestors not once believed that God is love, that charity is the foundation of all virtues, that all of us are equal before the eyes of God, that to fail to feed the hungry or care for the suffering is to sin against Christ, and that Christ laid down his life for the least of his brethren. Now, I bring that all to the cross, and what does it say? Is that we are all equally sinners. But it also says that we were all equally offered redemption, for God so loved the world, that's everyone, that whosoever shall believe in him, that's anyone, shall not perish but have everlasting life. It is an inclusive invitation to the exclusive means of salvation. And I think this is something that we have to wrestle with, because yes, there are things in the Bible that we have to wrestle with in terms of the slavery, the so-called slavery laws, which I think are not really anything like that. With the issues of women in the Bible and these kind of things, we have to wrestle with these things because they seem, and I would argue they only seem at odds with the case I just made, that belief in God, and not only just any God, but the belief in God of the Bible, dignifies all human beings. How do we reconcile these two things? Well, that's the whole point of the book.
Abdu, thank you for that reflection. Thank you for being so thorough in peeling off the layers of confusion that we see a lot. And actually, I was going to give you a follow-up question. Our topic today is Christianity, the only worldview that dignifies all human beings. And my question was, based on what you said, how does that play in the topic of racism and abortion? So those is a two-sided question. Now, before you answer, I want to bring a comment onto the screen, and because really this exemplified what is to be completely committed to an atheistic worldview. And I think that the disparity that brings to reality, to know that we are nothing more than worm food, if you will, if time do what time does, right? So let me go ahead and bring this question up, this comment. James Hall says, God does not exist. We are byproduct of random selection. Some are born healthy and others are born with deformities. We are not made in the image of God. We are decaying flesh and bone. And evidently, Mr. James Hall is a non-believer, but he really exemplifies what is the ultimate conclusion if reality is ruled by nothing but chance plus matter, time plus matter plus chance. And really, if that's the case, then the universe and reality as a whole is deterministic, which means either you or me have no choice but to be believers, and Mr. Hall has no choice but to be an unbeliever because everything is deterministic in a sense. We are sort of playing a giant game of dominoes, right?
Yeah.
But with that being said, how is it that the Christian worldview that dignifies human beings in a way that he calls us the apples of his eye, um, how does this play into the topic of racism and abortion? Because I was just in Wingate University with Frank, and I did the section during the presentation of the moral argument. And really, that is when you see the students kind of squirm in their seats when they hear about the fact that morality is objective and there is really no other way to live, even if just hypothetically speaking God didn't exist, there is no other way to live but in a way where morality, the responsibility, the you ought not murder or you ought not rape should be a universal responsibility for all. So I'm gonna leave you with that. And
Yeah.
before we go there, though, I want to let
Mhm.
everybody who has left comments in the chat. There are some magnificent questions. I'm gonna go ahead and bring them up as they come. I got some from Crafty Veteran. Kevin has some incredible questions. He says he's an agnostic. We have Lena. We have a bunch of other questions here. Jason has some good questions, but go ahead on and tackle that one while I start gathering these questions. And then again, make sure that you go to Abdu Murray's YouTube channel and make sure that you subscribe and follow and share this stream. It's absolutely free and you can help us out a lot. So Abdu, here's your answer.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Jorge. And I actually want to filter this through the lens of Mr. Hall's question. I couldn't hear the tone, obviously, with which he asked it, and he's quite strident and quite certain in his response that there is no God, and therefore we're just essentially decaying flesh. We're not made in God's image. I want to say a couple of things, and my guess is that I don't think he was actually saying this is the argument that because we're decaying flesh, that clearly means we weren't made in God's image. I don't think that he would make that argument because that doesn't follow. The fact that we're decaying flesh doesn't mean anything about the non-corporeal part of what we are. Is that just because our flesh decays doesn't mean that there's something about us that's indelible or something that's actually non-corruptible or non-decaying. Here's what I would say, though, is that my question becomes, why is it necessary if there is no God and therefore there's really no meaning to it, to reality, or no meaning to our lives, and nothing inherently valuable about us? What is, other than simply response to biochemical stimuli, what is the point of coming onto a stream and asking and making that statement? And following this kind of a thing. Now, I'm not saying that there is no point. I'm actually saying that there is a point. And the very fact that I think James responded the way he responded and said the things he said is because there's actually meaning to his actions, is that hopefully he feels that there is some semblance of meaning to why he's done what he's done. And if he feels there is no meaning to doing what he's done, then essentially he shouldn't have done it, or there is actually no should or shouldn't at all. It just is what it is. And as you pointed out, Jorge, it's just simply a reaction to external stimuli that's deterministic, and it bears no idea of free will. It's just statements that came out because he's programmed to do that. Whether it's right or wrong isn't the point. It's just the way he's programmed. And I'm programmed to respond right now the way I'm programmed to respond. So neither his statement nor my statements would have any meaning, in which case neither of us should have any right to be doing what we're doing. And him responding or him saying what he said essentially is an act that is like the wind blowing. It literally doesn't mean anything. But I think, one, his comment actually is a statement of agreement with me. The bulk of what I had made a comment about was that if there is no God, if there is no such thing as a God to give us his image, then there is no value to human beings corporately as an entire race, or individually in pockets such as our ethnicities, or individually even further yet in the granular level of any one particular human being. And I think his statement is basically the case in point. And I think you pointed it out so well, Jorge, is that the reality is, if there is no God, then there is no such thing as equal value. And so therefore, when we shake our fists and say that you ought not to treat a person as a commodity, slavery was wrong, you cannot say that. It's wrong. You can say maybe it's not evolutionarily convenient, but it essentially has no essential meaning to it, right or wrong, because there is no right or wrong standard by which to go. And I think basically by what he said that he's essentially agreeing with the point that I made. But the question is, does he or does anybody else listening to this actually think that there's no such thing as morally objectionable, objectively morally objectionable racism or morally objectionable sexism, not as a matter of convenience for evolutionary advantage, but as actually morally wrong? And if the answer is yes, then you have to deal with the fundamental conflict between believing that we are basically just decaying flesh, and that's all we are, as opposed to living in a world that is itself decaying, both physically and morally, yet there's something in us that rises up against this and says there's something immoral about all this, not evolutionarily inconvenient, but actually morally wrong. And if you have that sense that something about what I've talked about, whether it's racism or sexism, is inherently morally wrong, then you're presupposing that there's an objective standard by which to judge what's morally right and what's morally wrong. And that objective standard only exists if God exists. So let's look to the Bible then and think to ourselves just for a moment about whether or not the biblical message, not just any God, but the biblical message, whether it's the cross that we claim as the central point, that and the resurrection, that 3-day period, as the central point of all of the crux, as it were, of all of human dignity and all of God's love for humanity, and go before that into the Old Testament. And someone might say, well, there's slavery laws, and those slavery laws seem to suggest that no one is actually equally dignified before God because there is this slavery that goes on. The first thing I want to point out is that anything like that in the Bible is actually race and gender neutral. And I don't mean that in the current sense of gender neutral. I mean that the laws that seem to regulate some form of servitude in the Bible have nothing to do with one's ethnicity, literally zero to do with it. There is nothing about the servitude laws that exist in the Bible that are regulation for how Israelites are supposed to treat people, have nothing to do with their race or their ethnicity. It's literally, it couldn't be further away from transatlantic slavery as anything could possibly be. It has nothing to do with that. It also has nothing to do with what's called chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is the idea that people can be owned as property. That's what chattel slavery is. That's what the transatlantic slave trade was. It was race-based chattel slavery or ethnicity-based chattel slavery. That is not what's going on in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, what's going on is indentured servitude, voluntary servitude, where one person owes a debt to another person and then sells their services to a master, so-called master, even though the word slave is used, it could mean servant as well in this particular context, to pay off a debt. And by the way, when that debt is paid, the so-called master is required to pay liberally out of his own wealth, his land, his cattle, his money, to the freed servant, so that the freed servant will never actually fall into debt again. So what you have is an inherent idea of the dignity of human beings, regardless of their station in life, regardless if they're a creditor, regardless if they're a debtor, regardless of their ethnicities, regardless of their gender. Everyone is actually afforded the opportunity to not go to debtor's prison, but also to never go into debt at all, so they never have to go into servitude in the first place. So much of this is so different from the way in which we think of slavery. But let me go back even one step further and say, okay, you have someone like Richard Dawkins or other people who chastise the Bible as a God who is malevolent, cruel, a pestilential, malevolent, sexist, misogynistic, ethnic cleansing bully. That's what he calls God of the Bible. Well, these are all morally laden terms. Those are all moral judgments against the God of the Bible. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is he making those moral judgments on an objective sense of morality or a subjective sense of morality based on his own or our own current view of whether morality is a real, what morality actually is, what our standard current of morality actually is. And if he's doing it based on a subjective sense of morality, then wait 50 years and all the things that the Bible said are going to come into fashion again, and they won't be considered immoral, or slide back 50 years and they're perfectly fine. Whatever it is, the moral standard shifts. But if there's an objective morality upon which to call God a pestilential, malevolent, misogynistic, ethnic cleansing bully, then you all are presupposing that there is an objective moral standard that only makes sense if God exists. Now, having said that, when you look at the way in which the Bible actually shows God or depicts God as judging people of different tribes outside of the nation of Israel, you look at people like the Amalekites and the Anakites and the Canaanites and all these other ites, as it were. God is not judging them, and you'll notice this. God is not judging them because they're Canaanites or because they're Amalekites or because they're some other tribe other than Israel based on ethnicity. In fact, genetically speaking, they were largely indistinct from the people of Israel, all coming from an ancient Near Eastern, ancient Middle Eastern culture, or gene pool, as it were. So there was no genetic difference. There's nothing about them being darker in the Bible, or them being lighter, or them being of different languages. None of that's the reason for the judgment. It's because of their actions. They are judged. God uses the nation of Israel to judge other peoples because of child sacrifice, because of temple prostitution, because of the horrible ways in which they treated women, because of the horrible ways in which they treated other people outside of their tribes, and the raiding and the wars that was happening. In other words, God judged them not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. How do I know this? For sure, because Israel was also judged by God using those other peoples as instruments of judgment against Israel when she herself engaged in the same abominable practices. So if God was all about favoring one nation over the others in an ethnically cleansing way, God wouldn't use those other nations to judge Israel when she herself did the very same actions that those people were being judged for. In other words, there is no partiality at all between with God between people of different tribes. No, they weren't being judged based on the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, that ought to sound familiar, because the reality is that that Martin Luther King drew that principle that made his speech so famous when he dreamt of a day when people would not be judged based on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. He didn't pull that out of thin air. He pulled that right from the pages of Scripture to say that the God of the universe, the one who seats the objectivity of justice for all people, is the one who judges based on the content of character, not on the color of skin. In fact, so powerful was this message, and so real was this, that no less a luminary than Frederick Douglass himself said that he saw the difference. Now, this is important, and then I'll close with this so we can get to more questions. This is terribly important, because Frederick Douglass knew what it was to be treated like a piece of property as a former slave himself. He knew what it was to be treated this way. And having achieved his freedom, having gained his freedom, this is the man that Abraham Lincoln, when he did his second inaugural address, this is the opinion he wanted the most. He wanted to know what Frederick Douglass thought of his speech. And he said to him, "Mr. Douglass, there's no one else's opinion in this country I value more than yours." This same man, this freed slave, this intellectual giant of a person who wasn't speaking out of ignorance, who wasn't speaking out of emotionalism, who was speaking out of the pain of his lived experience, but also the objective reality of the words he could read in the Bible. This is what he says: between the Christianity of this land, meaning slaveholding the United States, and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. This is what he says now: I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. In other words, the real thing. I therefore hate the corrupt, slaveholding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. If this man could see the difference, with all of his faculties and all of his experience. And for us to say in this day and age that Christianity is inherently a racist belief system, I think that we have to recheck ourselves, because this man who led so many in a civil rights movement that started in the condition of slavery, he saw it differently. How dare we say we know better?
Whew, that's an answer, Abdu. Thank you so much for being so thorough. I actually was reading some of the comments, and that's what people are saying. Thank you for being thorough. Thank you for really, I mean, leaving no stone unturned. This is one of the great things of being able to control our streams and to be able to give ourselves time to unpack this. When we are at a college campus, we usually have to take no more than 5 minutes for an answer, so we can always just give them kind of a doorway to an answer and not a complete, robust and substantial answer. So what I want to do here, since we have so many questions, I want to go ahead and start giving them to you one by one. Take as long as you need. Some are off topic, which is fine. People come here to get answers, and that's exactly what we are trying to do. So I have this one coming from Facebook, and it's Lena Murphy ask, were there any other form of man created by God before Adam? And I think this kind of goes back to this idea that there was a pre-Adamic race. I hear this a lot when I do live streams with someone like Mike Heiser. There are these ideas there was a pre-Adamic race. So how would you answer that question?
Yeah, I think this. Some people call this gap theory. It depends on what you're asking exactly. Because if what you're asking is, now I have to actually clarify this some more. Because 5, 6, 7 years ago, I would have assumed that the question is proceeding from a position of what's called gap theory, is that there was a gap in the creation story, where we see in Genesis where God seems to create everything. And then it seems like, as some would say, he starts over, like everything gets destroyed, or that pre-Adamic humanity actually is wiped out, and then humans come on the scene, as it were, in terms of Adam and Eve. How I would essentially respond to this is that I don't really see anything in the text that's convincing enough to tell me that there was any need for us to be aware of, or for God to have created a pre-Adamic humanity, or even a hominid, sort of proto-human kind of race that had any kind of moral agency, and then God sort of started over again for whatever reason and started humanity all over again from brand new creation of Adam and Eve. It's very different than the Noah story, of course. So I don't really see a reason in the text for me to think that there would be a stop and start to this whole thing. I think what you see is that Genesis starts with an overall general view of creation, and then starts again, not in terms of God starts over again, but that with the story of Adam and Eve, you see a granular level of the first people. So God creates the world in the general sense in the beginning of Genesis, creates humanity in a general sense, and that includes, of course, Adam and Eve as the progenitors. And then, much like we see in some movies today, is that where you see a general story, you suddenly get really small, and you focus on two people. And this particular story focuses on the general outline of how God created, and then it focuses specifically on Adam and Eve. So there's no real gap where God starts over again. Now, I say that because, and I don't want to spend too much time on this particular question for the sake of other questions, but it's a good one. It's an important one, because it does go to the idea of human dignity as well, is that I say this because the Bible seems to focus exclusively on the moral agency of Adam and Eve, not on the moral agency of any pre-Adamic or pre-Adam and Eve hominids or human beings. So I don't think that there's any reason for us to believe that that was of any importance at all, and therefore why even go through the process. Second is this, though. Nowadays, of course, with William Lane Craig and Josh Swamidas talking about sort of through population genetics, whether we had any pre-human hominids that sort of bred in order to create Adam and Eve as the literal first people, you have to ask that question. And I don't know if the question's going that way or not. And I would leave people to be able to read that work by William Lane Craig and Josh Swamidass. I don't necessarily ascribe to all those views myself, but I do think it's worth thinking about how we can get down to, genetically speaking, the first Adam and Eve as the first people. But you had to have some pre-existent creatures before that in order for that to happen, or some pre-existent humanoid creatures in order to have their theory work out.
Excellent, Abdu. And I think that's one of the great things to have you here and to be able to have you producing content on your own platforms, because you're so well read. You're able to kind of give bring clarity to so many different topics. I got this one, and this one is tough. I know that Kevin is definitely a deep thinker, and I can kind of approach this. I think that it might be a little of a category mistake here. I don't know, Kevin. Maybe you can expand on the comment of my comment. But Kevin asked the following. He says, the principle of conservation of energy seems to leave no room for a soul to do anything. So what is a soul? What does it do? It seems unneeded. Now, honestly, I think that if a soul is immaterial, immediately the principle of conservation of energy kind of rules out any connection, because that applies to space, time, and matter, right? And the soul will be an immaterial thing. What is a soul? In my philosophical tradition, since I'm a Thomist, I would say that it is the form that informed the matter that instantiated, right? So, in other words, for me, the soul is the form of my body. What informs my body of what it is, right? It's also center of consciousness. I mean, it's related somehow immaterially with the brain, but it's not the brain. It's where my emotions and my thoughts originate from. So again, it seems unneeded. Well, if you make that connection that an immaterial soul should be ruled by a materialistic principle, then obviously it seems unneeded, because you're making this leap from the immaterial to the material. But I might be wrong. I figure it was worth bringing this up because Kevin has been participating a lot. So I just want to now, after my comment, let you fix probably the knot that I just made. But go ahead.
No, I think it's first of all, I want to say that I appreciate Kevin's question, because it is a deep question, and by the way, very well thought out in terms of the you're thinking obviously very, very deeply about the concepts of materialism and immaterialism and the mind-body problem. And there's some great resources by J.P. Moreland. If you're familiar with him, I think he does some great work on the mind-body problem and the idea of immaterialism and this kind of thing. So I think that there's some really great philosophical work being done on the mind-body problem, whether or not our physical bodies need something that's beyond the physical body in order for us to be truly and fully human, or if there's actually a valid connection between the immaterial and the material. But I will say, I'll back you up on that, Jorge, to say that I think there is a bit of I don't know if it's a category mistake, but there is a juxtapositional, I think, mistake here, is that something that's physical, conservation of energy and conservation of matter, really it's conservation of energy because matter is just organized energy in one sense, applies to the physical world. And so the question then becomes, does that principle apply to the non-physical or the immaterial world? Now, there are plenty of people who are atheists who are non-materialists. In other words, they believe that there is no God, or they lack belief in God, depending on how you describe it. But they would also say that there is an actual non-material world, like abstract objects and concepts being actually real in some sense. But let me suggest this. There's quite a bit of science right now that is out there, with whether it's fMRI studies about the way the brain works. And so we often think of that if you see stimuli, that something fires in your brain and causes you to think a certain way or feel a certain way. But really, a lot of great work is being done on the fact that we actually either can't measure which happens first, whether there's a thought, an immaterial thought that causes the brain to react in a certain way, or if the brain causes it vice versa. In fact, I think the trend in the studies is going the other way, where we're beginning to see that the thoughts, the immaterial thoughts, are actually influencing the brain. So there is at least some evidence that something that's non-material, at least non-material by any standard that we can actually currently measure, is affecting the material. So I think that you're right, Jorge, in the sense that the conservation of energy theory would only apply to the physical world, but not to the immaterial world. Now the question becomes, how does the immaterial affect the material? And I think we have precedent for this. I think we have a tremendous precedent for this. It's the creation of the universe. I think that when you look to the standard Big Bang cosmology, and I know we're looking at some of the things right now through the Webb telescope and all these things to look back through the passage of time, as it were, I still think that the standard model of Big Bang cosmology actually still holds plenty of water here, because what it basically says is that all matter, energy, space, and time actually began to exist at a finite point in the past. How long ago isn't the point, but that all matter, energy, space, and time began to exist in the finite past shows me something, that if those things began to exist, if matter, energy, space, and time began to exist, then matter wasn't the thing that caused it, because matter can't cause itself. Energy wasn't the thing that caused it, because energy doesn't cause itself. That's all philosophically ridiculous. Space can't cause it, and time can't cause it, because all of those things began to exist. And so if any one of those things began to exist, none of those things could be their own cause. That's patently philosophically absurd.
Mm-hmm.
And yet all of those things began to exist, which means that an immaterial, enormously powerful, yet a power that's not based on physical energy, spaceless and timeless being caused matter, energy, space, and time to exist. So we actually have precedent for when something immaterial affected all of things, affected actually the creation of all matter, energy, space, and time. So conservation of energy only applies once there are things that have energy in the physical world to apply to them. But energy itself is actually the creation of something outside of itself, an immaterial force that caused these things to occur in the first place. So I appreciate the question, but I do think it is a question that overlaps or mistakes the material for the immaterial. And then the question of, can the material be affected by the immaterial, I think has already been, at least whether conclusively or substantially answered by standard Big Bang cosmology, shows us that the immaterial can, in fact, not only influence the material, but cause the material in the first place.
That is really, really good. I never thought about it that way. It's very interesting because I always have these conversations with Eric
Oh, I
Hernandez.
can't hear you, Jorge.
Oh, why not? You cannot hear me anymore? Abdu, mic check.
Nothing yet. But you look great.
Thank you. Mic check. Can you guys hear me? Please, on the chat, can you guys hear me? Let me see.
I'll wave at you. Oh, there you are.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
All right, good. Okay, so what I was saying is it's really interesting. I've never heard it put that way, which is great. And actually, I think we have a mutual friend. I got an incredible picture of you standing beside Eric Hernandez, and it was one of the ETS pictures. And he is a substance dualist. I am a hylomorphist, and those are big philosophy words. And there is no interaction problem in the Thomistic view and the hylomorphic view, because really form and matter are, human beings are made up of form and matter, which is one thing that happens to be able to have an immaterial temporary state. Right, and that's where the resurrection, that's what Aquinas kind of say, hey, look at Aristotle and how the resurrection kind of fixed that issue. But going back to this, and people are saying, yeah, they can hear us both. Going back to this, Kevin has another terrific question, but I'm going to kind of skip because we have about 3 from him. And like you said, he's a deep thinker. Great question. Good. I have one from Brett, and this is what Brett says. Is this question: does not the full title of Darwin's book express the expected view of dominate and subjugated people, established by the races he established. So I think in by way of kind of trying to unpack it, without putting words in Brett's mouth, is the book of the Darwin's
Mhm.
book, the what is it called, the evolution of species, right?
Yeah,
um
the origin of
the
species,
origin of
and
species, yeah.
and it actually says within the title, and I'm trying to pull it up right now. It actually says, hold on a second, I got it right here.
Frank
I
knows
don't
it
want to
by
get it.
heart. Yeah.
Yeah, and I normally do have it by heart, but for some reason I'm blanking on it because it has the word favored races right
Right.
in the actual title. So what it is the uh, hold on a second, my goodness. But anyway, I think that this is right. I think that there's an issue right from where I quoted uh, the um, the problem of Darwinism, the origin of species by means of natural selection and the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Now, there are actually other uh, quotes from Darwin that I actually quote in More Than a White Man's Religion that are specifically um, talking about races. Like he actually names the races that are sort of unfavored, as it were, where he talks about Australians, and he's not referring to Australians as we think of them now in terms of white people. What he's referring to is actually Aboriginals, or Africans and others like that who are, and Asiatics, as he might put it, who are actually not favored races relative to Europeans or Caucasians. So not only is the title an issue, but there are actually other quotes of Darwin's that are troubling, and I think he actually was troubled in some sense by his own worldview as well.
Wow. um yeah, so we see kind of the natural conclusion that we get out of a Darwinian evolutionary perspective on our nature, right?
Hmm.
And I usually, when I talk to college students, it usually is that, what if that's the case? What's stopping me from beating you up, stealing your stuff, and doing whatever I want to your girlfriend in order to kind of spread my DNA, right? So I mean, it sounds
Hmm.
ugly, but it is a kind of shocking way to make a point. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to do that, or Lord forbid. But what I'm saying is, it's just a way to lay out a point. I have another
Yeah.
question here, and this one comes from Crafty Veteran. He asks, "Does Satan know he's ultimately doomed, especially when Jesus returns?" And one of the things that I want to say is, a lot of these questions come up because we see biblical prophecy that is so cryptic, and in hindsight we can kind of put it together. But I think biblical prophecy and what God wants us to know, especially what He wants some of these spiritual powers to know, it is kind of difficult to decipher beforehand, because
Hmm.
that's part of the plan. That's part
Yeah.
of God's plan. So, what do you think, Abdu?
Yeah. So I have a bit of a rule that I try to live by in terms of understanding these questions where there's a little bit of wiggle room in here, or at least some ambiguity. And the rule is this: where, and it's not my original rule, I got this wording from someone else. Where the Bible does not speak, I will not shout.
Mm,
Which means that if the Bible's not specific on a topic, or it's not like clear cut, I won't shout about it. Now, I might have my theories on it, where I think that there's a plausible case to be made, but I won't shout it as if it's like an indelible, like or a unquestionable um, dogma that you should ought to believe. So here's a theory on this. A couple of things. One is I'm sure Satan read the book. He's been around for a long time, and he's watched humanity in our interactions with the scriptures. In fact, we know that Satan knows the scriptures because he quotes them to Jesus when Jesus is actually in the wilderness. And Satan's crafty about this. He misquotes God frequently. And I don't think he misquotes God because he forgot what he had said. He misquotes God because he's the father of lies. Um, and I think about the original rebellion. Why is that Lucifer actually rebels? I think that there's a level to which, and this is just my supposition on this, there's a level to which Satan does not believe God. he actually recognizes that God is his superior, but because of his own self-pride, actually wants to be equal with the Most High. He wants to become the Most High. You have to have a certain level, not only of pride that is galactically huge, but you also have to have a certain level of ignorance, because if you actually think that, then you certainly don't understand who God actually is. And by the way, before we judge Satan a little too harshly on this, remember, that's the point of the Adam and Eve story, is that they did not want to be with God. They wanted to be God. They wanted to be the determiners of right and wrong. And so, yes, I think Satan was in a position to know better than Adam and Eve, because of his proximity and his presence with God. But I think that it's simply the case that Satan doesn't know everything, but he also doesn't believe everything. There may be the case where he actually read the back of the book, as it were, found out what the ending was, but doesn't believe that's how it's going to go. Or he does know how it's going to go, and he's so enraged by it that his pride keeps him from actually changing or repenting or whatever it might be. It's just who he is. It is in his nature. Now, these are suppositions, but let me just give one example of why I think something like this might be true. One is that if the Bible is correct, that Satan continues to act the way he acts, and he is fully aware of what the scriptures say about him, he either doesn't know it, he either doesn't believe it, or he is so prideful that he's enraged by it and can't change his behavior because he gets in his own way, as it were, because he's evil. You look at the story of Lazarus and the rich man. The story goes, of course, it's a parable where there's a beggar named Lazarus who is ignored by a very rich man. He's ignored his whole life. He's a beggar, and the rich man will not condescend to help the man. And this is not mine, by the way. I get this from Ken Bailey. He points this out, that as Jesus points out in this parable, the rich man dies and Lazarus dies. And Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom. In other words, he's in heaven. And the rich man is in hell. So he is separated. And he says to Abraham, as he sees Lazarus in Abraham's bosom, he says, "Father Abraham, send Lazarus here to dip his finger in the river so he might cool my tongue." And Abraham says, "No, there's an unpassable chasm between us." Then he says, "Well, send Abraham to talk to my brothers so that they won't come to this wretched place." And Abraham says, "Well, even if they're not going to believe it, they wouldn't even believe it if somebody told them." The important point that Bailey points out is, notice who the rich man talks to. He doesn't talk to Lazarus. He talks to Abraham. He never would talk to Abraham during his lifetime. He never would talk to Lazarus during his lifetime. He would never condescend. His pride was so great that this rich man would never condescend to talk to a lowly beggar. And even though Lazarus is in heaven now, he still won't bring himself to condescend to talk to Lazarus. He treats Lazarus like a servant, as if Abraham should treat him the same way. The point is this, is that there is no real repentance in hell. You are who you are, and Satan is who Satan is. So either he doesn't believe the end of the story, or his pride is so vast and so corrupting, and he's so thoroughly corrupted that he stays who he is. He's in his own form of hell before the lake of fire even get to him.
Wow. Great answer, Abdu. We got a couple more here, and I do want to touch. There is one that I want to take right now, and is related to your book. So we're talking about, is Christianity the only worldview that dignifies all human beings? And we also want to let you guys know that this is Abdu's new book right here. Let me see. Right here. There you go. More Than a White Man's Religion, and the subtitle is Why the Gospel Has Never Been Merely White, Male-Centered, or Just Another Religion. So make sure that you go and pick this up from Amazon or anywhere where books are sold. Now, Abdu, we want to give away a couple of copies, physical copies of the book. The last time we did some digital copies, but we want to do physical copies, and I'm just going to share with you guys how simple it is to get this. So right here, you're seeing this is Abdu's YouTube channel. What you need to do is make sure that you give Abdu a subscribe. Go ahead and subscribe and follow his channel. Make sure that you enable the bell notification, so every time Abdu uploads a new video or put new material, you'll be able to see it. So right now we're live. So if you go here, you're going to see that we have a special Q&A going on. So what I want you to do is to go into the Q&A and leave a comment. So what you need to do is come down here. This is especially since we're fresh out of Halloween, he had a tremendous 1 hour show about the topic. So what I want you to do is make sure that you go to this live stream that we're on right now, and you go ahead on and leave us right here in this segment in the comments. Make sure that you leave a comment. Okay, you subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and tag a friend and let them know to subscribe to Abdu's channel, and immediately you will be automatically added to the list of participants for a signed couple of books by Abdu Murray. So make sure that you go ahead and do this. It's very simple. Subscribe to Abdu's YouTube channel. Come to this, find this particular, all you have to do is go to the live tab, click on the live stream. I'm not going to click because it's going to start playing automatically. And that's why I use this sample here. So you can go and actually click here on comment. Make sure that you leave a comment, you tag a friend, and you subscribe to the channel. So that's the way. And also, while you're doing that, on the way there, go ahead and go to embracethetruth.org and check out all the great stuff that Abdu is doing through his ministry. So make sure you subscribe here, you follow him on Instagram, and make sure that you follow him on Facebook as well. So this question, Abdu, is related to your book. Isaac Campbell, who he says, "Hey, I came in late. What is the topic?" And he left us a great question. And the question is the following. He says, "Regarding your book, More Than a White Man's Religion, what are the methods you use to avoid being forced by today's social surges that lead people away from the Bible?"
Well, wow, what a great question! I love that question because the social surge is pretty strong. Actually, I think that right now the surge is so strong that it forces us to get on a train. We're on a platform, and it forces us to get on a train that's speeding away from Christianity. And resisting the social surge becomes very, very difficult because part of that surge is driven by the media. Part of that surge is driven by pain. It's driven by actual stories of actual people being treated poorly and unequally because of their race or because they're women. So that surge is not insignificant. And it's not just simply a fiction. It's there because there's a felt need within society. And I think the way to resist the surge while respecting the felt need is to actually plant ourselves into the word, the scriptures themselves, and look to the life of Jesus as the model for it. We have to take a pause, and in this world, everything is breakneck speeds. There's that one phrase, a lie can get around the world before the truth has had a chance to lace up its shoes. And so what we do oftentimes is we jump into the race to jump in and get as fast as we possibly can, and sometimes say half-baked things in response to challenges against Christianity, where I think the greatest form of resistance can be just to slow down a minute and say, okay, I heard the objection. And it's easy to make objections. Responses are difficult. Objections come in bumper sticker form. Nowadays we argue by meme. We have a picture of Boromir from Lord of the Rings saying something, and then we have a caption around it and think it's really clever, and that solves the issue. That's not an argument. That's just an assertion. But it sounds really clever, and we want to respond back with a meme ourselves. I think one of the greatest forms of resistance against the social surge is just to pause for a moment and take the objection seriously, and then give the response that it deserves. Oftentimes, though, we have to realize something, that because of the surge, there'll be people who are rushing past us to get on the train who won't hear what we're saying. Maybe the answer is that we stand right in the way. We don't get outside the crowd. We stand planted firm in the crowd to make them part around us like a river, but they will have to part around us by taking notice of what we're saying. So I think that's the important point. And if I look to see stories of how Jesus actually interacted with people, or even the Old Testament stories, the book of Esther is a wonderful example of how a woman is the hero of the story. Mordecai, of course, is the hero as well, but a woman is the hero of the story. The book of Ruth is a wonderful book where Ruth, a Moabite woman, becomes the hero, and as he is in the lineage of Jesus, she actually, a non-Jewish woman, becomes so important to the history of the redemption of the world that she's included in the genealogies that the New Testament actually records for Jesus. There's Deborah becomes a judge over all of Israel, including the men. You see so many stories of this from the gender point of view, but you also see wonderful stories where heroes are people who aren't even within the nation of Israel, where people's faith who aren't even Jews is rewarded and lauded by Jesus as true and robust faith. You see this over and over again. So here's what I would say. The social surge is based on the idea that there is a corrupt, bad story in the gospel, and that the so-called secular solutions are the way to go. That the progressive solutions, so to speak, whether it's political or it's religious or it's theological, those are the real solutions for progress. It's right in the name, progressive. My goodness, how much better can you possibly get? I think the response is not to just simply say, the propositional ideas of the philosophy. I thought this is important. The philosophy behind the fact that the Bible posits a God who could be the very seat of the morality we're using to judge the Bible. No, it's not just that. That's important, but it's not just that. What we have to do, I think, is offer a better story, offer a better narrative. And that narrative is not new, and that narrative is not novel. That narrative is ancient, and it's therefore eternally contemporary. So when folks want to say something like, there's all these racial problems and all these issues, and it's Christianity's fault, what we can offer them instead of saying, no way, Jesus loved everybody, not just saying those things, but sharing a story and saying, can I share with you a story for a moment? There is this time when Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman, a Samaritan who is hated by Jews and who hates Jews right back. Racial tension. A woman who dare not even speak to a rabbi, yet speaks to Jesus at Jacob's well. And in fact, she says to Jesus that the well that he seeks to draw water from is so deep. What an irony there, because the story of the woman at the well and Jesus' encounter with her is itself an unfathomably deep well from which we can draw so many things. Jesus takes a Samaritan woman. She's not only rejected because of her ethnicity, she's rejected and considered second class because of her gender. He takes her and he says to her that you can be among those who worship God in spirit and in truth. You are the kind of believer that the Father seeks. And she's so excited by this that she goes to her village, who has a social surge away from Jews. They are saying Jews are terrible, Jews are awful. Here comes this woman who is rejected even by them. And she says, come and see a Jewish man who told me all I ever did. Perhaps he's the Messiah. And then they do. And then they do. And they say, truly, this man is the Savior of the world. That would be akin to a Black Lives Matter protester telling people that this guy who looks like a Klansman in every way that they can think of is actually not who they think he really is, and he can bring reconciliation. And then they believe her, and then they come to him and they say, you're not who we thought you were at all. We thought you were among these people who treat us poorly. You're not that at all. You're the real deal, and we want to follow you. That's how radical that would have been in her day and age, and that's how radical he can be for us. Jesus is an eternal radical, but he's also the evener. He actually stabilizes history as well. So I would say the way to resist the social surge is to tell a better story, and that story is not just a fable, not just a parable, but it actually in history happened. That's how the Roman Empire got changed. That's how the West got all of its good values. Ask Tom Holland, the historian, not the Spider-Man guy, but Tom Holland, the historian, all about this in his book Dominion. He points out that it's the Christian message that told the better story, that was the myth made true, as it were, to show us the equality we can have as human beings. Everything good we got as a vestige of Christian theology and history.
Praise God. Awesome. Abdu, we're coming up to the hour and a half time mark, and we want to respect your time and the time of our audience, but there's a couple of questions that I would like for you to tackle here. And before we do that, guys, please just come on to the channel, give a subscribe, go ahead on and comment, leave a comment, tag a friend, and you will be automatically added to the giveaway for a physical copy of Abdu's new book. And if you want a copy and you don't win, just go ahead on and get you one. You can go to Amazon, you can go anywhere where books are sold, get you a copy. It's definitely the kind of timely book that you need right now to be able to speak intelligently about these topics. And after this amazing answer, Abdu, I got a question from Jenna, and she asked, "What does it mean that God is love? What does it means that God is love?" Because we need it. And actually, as I see some of the comments coming in, some were alluding to this. So this is gonna edify more than just Jenna. So give us your answer.
Well, Jenna, I'm so thrilled you asked this question because it gets me to talk about my favorite topic in the whole world, which is the Trinity. When I was a Muslim, I thought this was also my favorite topic because I thought it was the one that Christians couldn't even define, let alone defend. And now it's my favorite topic still because it makes sense of so much of Christian theology, but also our own existence as well. So let me parse this out if I can, in as briefly as I can. But this is so important. Thank you for asking, Jenna. When we say God is love, it's important for us to recognize that we're not saying that love is God. I think there's a tendency within various circles, whether it's mystical circles or secular circles, that sort of have love as the greatest sort of benchmark for all things. And love to them is this unbounded affirmation for everyone, no matter what they think or say or do, that we make love into our God. Now, that's different because love, the feeling, love, the idea, love, the emotion becomes the standard for all of our conduct. But that's not what the Christian is saying. That's not what the Bible is saying. The Bible is not saying that love is God. It is saying that God is love, that God is the source of love. How does that make any kind of sense? I think in every other worldview, every other religious worldview, whether it's a pantheistic worldview or a monotheistic worldview, I think there's something lacking there that doesn't actually make sense of this idea that God is love, even though those worldviews might even ascribe to a loving God or gods plural or the universal absolute in certain pantheistic thought. Here's why I say that, is that if God is the only uncreated being, and I think that God is the only uncreated being, everything else was created, then there existed a time when nothing but God actually existed. Now, if nothing but God actually existed and God is loving or God is love, then how could he possibly express that? How could he actually be love if there's nothing outside of himself to love? He would have to create something else to love that thing, which means that he needs something else to exist to be who he is. And if God is also unfathomably and incomparably great, then he would need nothing. If he's perfect, he would need nothing to be who he is. And yet, if he exists as one, solid through and through, there's no differentiation or distinction within God, and he's loving, then he needs to create something outside of himself that makes him imperfect because he lacks something, the ability to love in and of himself. The Trinity actually solves this issue because the concept of who God actually is in the Christian message is that God is one. There is only one God, and he is uncreated, but that God exists in one nature, one substance, with three divine minds. That one nature has three minds, three who's, as it were, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so the Father eternally, always, from everlasting to everlasting, always loved the Son. The Son always loved the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit always loved the Father and the Son. And on it goes in the community of the Trinity from eternity. So God actually is a being who is in relationship. So God never needs anything outside of himself to love, because within himself, with the tri-personhood of the Trinity, actually loves in every way. He loves internally towards himself. He loves externally towards one other, the Father to the Son or the Son to the Holy Spirit or whatever, but also communally. In all forms of love, he exists perfectly within that framework of the Trinity. So when the Bible says God is love, And if God is a triune being, that phrase actually makes sense. If God were not a triune being, that phrase wouldn't really make sense. But because of the Trinity, God can be the God of love because he doesn't seek relationship, he defines relationship. And so, if that's the case, and he is the cause of all of us, he is the uncaused cause, that means we are the effect. And we reflect something of the divine. We reflect something of our creator. The reason why we seek out relationships, reason why we covet relationships, the reason why we're not just hive beings like bees or ants or even flocks of birds or herds of cattle. We don't associate with one another out of sheer survival instinct. No, we have meaningful, actual relationships, is because we reflect God's image, and God's image is one of inherent relationship because he's a triune, unified in diversity being. And so we seek unification in our diversity with other human beings as well. And that explains why we are the way we are. And so our love, our true actual love, not our instinctual chemical responses to various stimuli around us, but the actual love we feel for one another is best explained by a triune God who is himself love. And so to answer this question, what does it mean when we say God is love? It means that he is the source of true intimate relationship because he has that within himself. And therefore, out of the abundance of his love and of his creation, imbues each one of us with that same capacity and that same desire. Now, this relates to the book. I don't want to necessarily ham-handedly go into it, but that's the reason why when we see rejection or diminution because of our race or because of our sex, male or female, that is a violation of our purpose. That is a destruction of the core value of what we are, which we are beings that seek perfect relationship. Now, we're imperfect beings, and so we can't have perfect relationship with each other. But God is the one who is perfect and therefore perfects, ultimately, in the redemption of humanity, the relationship we were originally intended for. So this idea of what is God, what does it mean to say God is love? This is such a deep thing. I know there's more to say about this, but time doesn't permit. But let me just say this, that everything from human existence makes sense if we have a God who is love, and that God is love only makes sense if God is himself a triune being.
Wow, Abdu. That is deep. You can definitely tell that you're passionate about that topic. It can definitely come across as something that you want to hear more and more and more about. And like I said, it's not something that we're going to exhaust in a 5-10 minute answer. But as we're trying to steer the conversation back to the title of this stream, which is Christianity the only worldview that dignifies all human beings? That's the question that we started off with. You gave us a great 15-minute kind of unpacking of that, the answer to that question. For those who got here a little late, you can rewind this or just wait for us to finish the live stream, and then you can go back and watch the beginning, and you can see. And this is a topic that Abdu talks about in his book. As you can see right there on the screen, is called More Than a White Man's Religion, and the subtitle of it is why the gospel has never been merely white, male-centered, or just another religion. And that is the book that we are telling you right now to buy, not just because Abdu wrote it, but because it's really, really timely. And we want to make sure that you guys also go to Abdu's YouTube channel, because he's putting a lot of content out there, and also he's doing it on Instagram and he's doing it on Facebook. But also to make sure that you enter the giveaway by subscribing to his channel, leaving a comment on this video. All you have to do is go into the comment section and leave a comment and tag a friend, and that's all you need to do. We're going to be looking in the next 24 hours to see how many comments we have and who is going to be able to get a signed copy of Abdu's book. While you're there, make sure that you check out embracethetruth.org. That's where Abdu is doing a lot of his work. And if you want to bring Abdu to speak at your church or your college campus, make sure that you invite him to come, because the same way that we do a cross-examine, it's usually by invitation that we get to go to all of these places. And right now, it is one of the most, I will say, needed times to talk and to speak on this topics. But just to wrap it up, Abdu, Kevin has another great question, and I think is a magnificent way to close tonight's awesome live stream. And he asked the following, and like I said, we already kind of settled with the idea that Kevin is a deep thinker. So he asked the following question. He says, if one accepts that Christianity does dignify humans more than atheism, do you propose that this makes Christianity more likely or just more appealing but not more likely?
Great question, Kevin. Again, nice thinking through these things. I really appreciate the way in which you're trying to get through the nuances of these things. A couple of things. I think it's actually both. I know that's probably sort of like the quintessential lawyer answer, but I'm a lawyer by trade, so I get to answer that way. Hope you can appreciate that a bit of that, Kevin. Here's what I would say is that one, it is I think any worldview that you see to ascribe to as a human being, I think has to have logical and epistemic warrant to it. In other words, it has to have truth value. It's not just more likely in the sense that, well, it's more likely that this will appeal to me, but it's actually got to be more likely in that it's more likely than not true as compared to its so-called competitors, as it were. I say so-called only because it's not a competition in the sense that we're trying to make sure that we sell more product than anybody else. We're in a worldview discussion here. And worldviews matter because they determine how you view the world. And so they not only talk about your eternal destiny, but they actually speak about your present reality as well and how you'll interact with the world. What we make sense of in terms of what we mean by we say God exists or doesn't exist will naturally have implications for how we will behave and think of other human beings. And it's not only on an individual level, but also on a societal level. So I say all that to get to this point, is that I think that if we are to posit the idea that there are, in fact, objective moral values, from a deductive moral argument standpoint, you have the classic formulation of the moral argument, is that objective moral values and duties only exist if God exists. Objective moral values and duties exist, therefore God exists. Now, moral values and duties include the idea that people are equal. That's a moral value. The duty imposed upon us would be that we ought to act like that. We ought to treat people equally. If there is no God, then the moral value doesn't exist. And if there is no God, there's no obligor. There's no outside source that obligates us to actually act that way other than our mere convenience. And when that is exhausted, we might as well just do what we want. So I think that if the premises are true, the conclusion logically follows. But there's also an abductive way to look at the moral argument. And that abductive way is to say essentially that the existence of objective moral values is more likely on God's existence. And there's a great book by Baggett and Walls called, I think it's called Good God. In fact, I know it's called Good God. And they make a case for the existence of the more likely existence of God based on the existence of objective morality, and vice versa as well, that moral values and duties are more likely to exist in a world where God exists. Based on the so I think that I would answer the case that epistemically, and I think even logically speaking, that if Christianity does in fact dignify all human beings, and the moral value of the dignifying or the equality of all human beings is actually a real moral value, then it is more likely, and I would even say deductively so, that Christianity is true. So it's at least more likely, if not actually true, that if the moral value of human equality exists, then Christianity, so belief in God is deductively, I think, follows, but Christianity as the form in which we ought to believe in who this God actually is far more likely. Second is that it does have its appeal. And I would expect a worldview that's true to have an appeal. And in fact, while the appeal doesn't make it true, I think the appeal, and I would say that this is at least some form of an argument that's similar to the argument from desire, as Lewis puts it, an appeal of the Christian faith at least indicates that there's something about it that is praiseworthy enough or ideal enough to have indicia, little indications that perhaps it's true. But there's an appeal to it. And I think that appeal is worth us actually considering. You know, it was Marcello Pera, who was an atheist philosopher and a politician in Italy, who pointed out that we need the Christian message, that if we were to actually act as if we were Christians, then we would not appeal to arbitrary rules. We wouldn't equate every desire with a moral right to act that way. We wouldn't subjugate people as lower than us. We wouldn't engage in all of these things. We would find the world far more appealing if we were to actually live as Christ would have us live. Now, this is an atheist talking. I think of Matthew Paris, the atheist who pointed out that when he returned to the homeland from which he was born, it was Nyasaland when he was born there, but now it's called Malawi, that he pointed out that the equality and the helps that were coming to the people of Malawi because of Christian evangelism. Note what he said, and he was specific. He said, not because of international aid efforts, not because of non-governmental organizations, not because of education. None of these things actually created any sense of transformation in the populace of Malawi. He said it was specifically Christian evangelism that made the difference. And his quote was, "The rebirth is real, the change is good." And this is coming from a person who was an increasingly growing atheist, who pointed out that Christianity has its appeal, not only because it makes us feel good, but because it actually renders good in the world. So you have, I think, the likelihood of Christianity being more likely based on the fact that it dignifies human beings, because it not only instantiates the moral value of human equality, but it actually obligates us to live like human beings actually have moral equality. That makes it more likely, at least. And then it's actually more appealing because it actually creates in us a desire to live like that. Now, do I believe in a miracle motif where if we just simply all believed the same thing, if we all believed in Christianity, we'd suddenly have no racism and no sexism? Of course I don't. History has shown us that there have been plenty of people who ascribe to the gospel message, who understand it pretty thoroughly, actually, but still were products of their time, some of whom even owned and possibly even justified racism. But they did that not because they lived consistently, but because they lived inconsistently, even with their core values and beliefs. So the trick here is not just to find it more likely to be true, not to find it more appealing, but to take the likely and the appealing, apply them to our lives, and then actually live it out, not only as if it were true, but live it out because it actually is true.
And with that magnificent answer, Abdu, we can wrap it up for tonight. Thank you, everybody on the other side. Make sure that you pick up a copy of Abdu's book. You can pick it up anywhere books are sold. Make sure that you go to Amazon, leave a review after you read the book. We don't want you to just leave a review to leave a review. We want to make sure that you read it, you internalize this material, that you learn from the hard work that Abdu put into putting this book together. Share the book with other people. Usually when I buy a book that is this good, I buy a couple of copies to give away, and actually we're giving away a couple of copies right now that are signed. Many people have asked, how do you enter the giveaway? And again, I'm going to give it to you one more time. It's really, really simple. So what I'm going to do, Abdul, let me see. Okay, right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen really quick. I'm going to show people how to enter the giveaway. As you can see, what you're seeing right now is this stream. This is exactly what you need to do. You need to go to Abdu's YouTube channel right here. You make sure you subscribe. We have 711 subscribers. We had 600 and some change when we started. So obviously you guys have started to subscribe. So make sure you subscribe. Make sure you go to the live tab right here and you click here, and then you click on this live stream, the one that you're in right now. That's after the live stream. Don't do it now, because then you got not going to listen to the rest of the instructions. And then you go here, and when this live stream is over, you will be able to leave comments. So you will leave a comment down here. Number one, subscribe to the channel. Number two, you leave a comment. And number three, you tag a friend in this particular live stream. Now, we had a lot of positive comments about how awesome this live stream was. We're gonna try and do one of these more often, because part of the ministry of Embrace the Truth is to bring reasonable answers to all of you. And you guys, please do not forget to subscribe to Abdu's podcast. Abdu, tell us a little bit more about your podcast, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jorge. It's called All Rise. I am trained as a trial lawyer, and I did that for a lot of years. And so, what All Rise does is we take a look at the objections against and the claims for Christianity and subject them to the rules of evidence, criminal procedure, trial procedure, civil procedure, the way juries think, the way juries are instructed to make their rulings, the way judges make their rulings, and see if the objections or the claims actually hold water with that level of scrutiny. Sometimes we'll sustain the objection that someone might make against the Christian faith, but it doesn't necessarily knock out the Christian faith. It just simply responds to a way in which Christians often have argued. But oftentimes we'll point out that the objection against the Christian faith might not hold as much water as we once thought. So we go through various objections, and there's a new episode every other Monday. And on November 7th, we're actually launching the video version of it. Right now, there's a full season of 16, I believe, episodes in audio form on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. But soon on November 7th, there'll be not only the audio version of new episodes of the podcast, but there'll also be video episodes on YouTube. All Rise is the channel to go to.
All Rise, that's exactly it. Make sure that you subscribe. Make sure you share it. Make sure you share his channel. If you think that Abdu need to be followed by more people, not because we want to be famous on social media, but because we want to make King Jesus famous. And right now we have a culture that is begging for good answers. Not only answers, but good and true answers. So with that being said, thanks everybody on the other side of the screen. We love you. Thank you for Embrace the Truth Ministries. It makes this possible. Also, I want to thank Frank for allowing us to use, the outlet for Cross-Examine to do this. All of the people that are commenting and interacting with us, make sure that you enter the giveaway. We have a couple of books, and we want to make sure that you make yourself available to interact with our content, and hopefully we're able to edify you more and more every day. Abdu, thank you very much for this almost 2 hours that you have given us. We know how valuable your time is and how valuable the time of everybody on the other side of the screen is. So with that being said, thank you very much, and God bless.
God bless everyone.